We're just a few weeks away from the NHL entry draft, and the Winnipeg Jets appear to be on the move. Luke Evangelista and more coming right up on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Thanks for tuning in. Obviously, you are probably watching the Cup final, so if you are just wrapping that up, Game 3, of course, looks to be a pretty fun one. Obviously, you're probably wondering what the Jets are up to, right? Things have been quietly moving, and it seems like Winnipeg is having a rather active start to their summer, and that's not usually what we hear with this team. But it feels like there's some sort of internal pressure. Aside from Chipman kind of coming out with that letter to the fan base, really saying that the Jets were committed to winning the Cup, we haven't really had a lot of recent news other than, maybe one or two implied departures. The rumors around Ehlers continue to swirl. And so there hasn't been a lot of crumbs regarding acquisitions. Now, that's finally changed. Past couple of days, there's been some really random buzz around Luke Evangelista, and I don't quite know where this came from. It's been filtered through a number of different fans, and it's circulating online. Cole Perfetti following Evangelista on social medias. Apparently, there might be some negotiations between the Jets and Evangelista's agent, which is interesting. You don't really see this too often with Jets targets. I mean, we haven't really seen a lot of stuff publicly get leaked like this. If there's anything to it, I would say for now, let's take it with a bit of a grain of salt. But the fact that this stuff might be moving is intriguing. Evangelista, obviously, you might have heard from the Nashville Predators. He's been around a 30-ish to 35-point middle six guy with some intriguing upside. Pretty decent shooter. That was a lot of what his junior days were known for. He was a raw product back in the day. From the footage that's out there of some of his goals and stuff, he seems like a pretty solid player. He's in good positions to make decent passes. He's usually winning some battles along the wall. He has a fairly decent shot. I wouldn't say that there's anything that's going to be jaw-dropping in his game, but if you're looking for some really affordable young wing depth that the Preds might be willing to cut bait with, this seems like a pretty low-cost gamble. I like it. I'm not quite sure how this is all going to work if the Jets are trying to offer sheet, especially on the lower end. I think Evangelista's projected contract is somewhere in like the $2.5 to $3 million range. So not a lot, right? And if the Jets were to go that route, they'd only be giving up a pretty small package. You could also just trade for him outright, and that kind of seems like an option. I think the Jets would probably want to do that unless they go the offer sheet route, which I could see them doing. Just for how Winnipeg has usually operated, I feel like offer sheets are kind of slightly taboo in some ways. Not as much as they used to be, mind you, but enough to where, NHL GMs probably don't want to irritate other guys. And so my guess is if they do an offer sheet, it's because they know Trotz has already expressed some level of comfort with cutting him loose and not really matching. So intriguing little stuff there. If Evangelista does somehow become a Jet over the next few weeks, I could see him sliding into maybe the third line spot. I guess I do wonder if this is Winnipeg trying to find some internal competition, for maybe your middle six spots, and bringing in Evangelista from the outside could maybe add a little bit more depth, some scoring help. I think that there's one thing that was very clear to the front office, and it's that, let's be real, right? The bottom six could not provide a lot of offense in the postseason. And if your top six is struggling to score, not having guys with decent sets of hands in your bottom six is only going to make life harder. No disrespect to Appleton. I think sometimes He takes a lot of flack for stuff that's not necessarily his fault. Him playing more than Ehlers is not a thing that he decides. It's kind of on the coaching staff to recognize what his role is. But, all that said, he did have that empty net against the Stars that he'll probably not ever feel like he can live down. And, in moments like that, you'd want that extra level of finishing talent. And that's where Evangelista might be able to come in. Now, Luke does have some upside. You notice he'll score around 30 to 35 points, playing between somewhere in 13 to 15 minutes a night. If you think about him potentially earning more time as a young 23-year-old winger, and he starts to earn more responsibility, hey, you know what? That's a solid gamble. This is the kind of stuff where I feel like the Jets could really make some money off of this stuff, right? You're not looking to bring in perhaps the world's greatest players, right? You're looking for guys who are smart gambles. And so that to me is pretty interesting. This also following the news that Dmitri Rashevsky has signed a 3-year contract offer over in Russia. Now, intriguingly, it seems like he's getting traded from Moscow to, I think it's Avangard. And if that does happen, he apparently has the ability to reject a trade and accept an offer with the Jets. So I don't think that that's going to happen. My feeling is that he does intend to stay in Russia. You think about an early to mid-20s guy who hasn't maybe been promised NHL ice time. He's going to have to come to Winnipeg and probably earn an NHL spot. I just don't know if there's a lot of incentive for that. Chibrikov, I think, had a slightly inside track and was also more willing to, maybe stay with the Moose for a year or so. But he's also a good few years younger. Rashevsky's 24, 25 now. So I kind of feel like this Evangelista thing is a good stopgap if that doesn't work. Rashevsky could have been a really intriguing player in Winnipeg as a middle six scorer. But again, we'd have to fight for a roster spot. He hasn't played on NA ice really before, so I just hadn't really factored him into Winnipeg's plans. I didn't think that his game was super crazy either. I'm not looking at him as a star young player that the Jets would be missing out on. But, again, when you're a team that drafts prospects and needs to develop and actually get them to the NHL, I think it would be nice if you could turn players like Rashevsky into success stories. But, again, my broader feeling is I'm not that fussed about it if he stays overseas, but that door hasn't entirely closed. Based on this, though, I'm not really expecting him to move over, so bringing in an Evangelista on a really bargain price would be fantastic. And given that the Jets have traded with the Preds recently and gotten some pretty good stuff for cheap, I'm kind of inclined to think that this price tag for Evangelista might not be crazy. Maybe you get him for a 3rd round pick or something. I don't know. Maybe a small extra prospect added on. Just seems like this could be, a solid deal for the Jets. And bets like these where you can sort of round out your I guess, middle core of your team, that's where I think the Jets can really do some damage. Obviously, they still need a couple of really high-end pieces, but some of that stuff is just not that likely. So if you can support the team elsewhere and find some real underappreciated scoring depth and try and fill out that way, you have some other core guys that you can build around, right? And that's where maybe the Jets can get that extra 5 to 10% more better on top of what they already did this past season. So I like this move. I think it's an intriguing little thing, and it might also give us into a window as to whether or not the Jets are starting their offseason a little bit early. We'll chat about what this might mean for Winnipeg's upcoming action over the next few weeks. Obviously, the draft is just on the 27th here in a few weeks. And so Winnipeg might be starting to tip its hand that this is going to be in a very busy offseason. And we'll chat about the implications of that in just a brief moment. Ever check your bank account and wonder where all your money went? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in. It's your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. It's kind of like having Kevin Chevaldayoff manage your budgeting and accounting. It's great. It's an all-in-one complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and start building your wealth. Just like this could be the summer of Chevy, where you have some big signings and major acquisitions, this could also be the summer review with Monarch Money. It helps you track everything all in one app, so you don't need to balance tons of different installations and stuff, lots of accounts. It's all in one place, and it helps you even set goals that you can also share with a spouse or partner, so you're always on the same page and avoiding a lot of the stress of shared accounts. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com. Code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about some intriguing stuff already kicking off for the Winnipeg Jets. Obviously, it's been a quiet start in some ways, but there have been some early rumors and maybe a departure or two that I don't know that a lot of us were expecting. Stuff that's kind of out of the ordinary for the Jets. We've heard about the Evangelista link, the Kupari departure. Of course, the Ehlers thing is still outstanding, and I know everyone, or at least one or two of you, keep saying it's speculation. At some point, you're just going to have to prepare yourself. It's probably happening. The amount of NHL media that continues to talk about this is a big deal. If you are hoping that Ehlers is going to stay, I just feel like you're setting yourself up for disappointment. It could absolutely happen. It's just not that likely, and I think that that's kind of where it's at. There's quite a few teams out there who could bring a guy like him in. And so the Jets offseason has a lot of priorities. And honestly, the Jets really just need to act like Ehlers is already gone. I think that that's the only way that they can really do this, because if they just keep sitting out there and waiting for some movement to happen, especially ahead of July 1st, you're going to be in a tougher spot. You want to make sure that you are proactive and not letting things get to a point where you don't have backup plans. But based on what we're seeing with Chevy so far, I do think the Jets are planning to make some more aggressive moves than we've seen. So kind of assessing things, Evangelista and Toews look like they're incoming. You've heard me talk about Toews. I know people keep talking about the leadership aspect. That's great, but there are other veterans out there who have actually played in the last 2 years that can offer good leadership. We just traded for one for a second-round pick, which, mind you, I'm still not a fan of. But like Shen has the locker room leadership and Stanley Cup experience already. So, Toews just doesn't really help all that much. He will probably be your 4C, but the way that the media keeps talking about him, especially like Dreger mentioning him as the 2C, like stand-in until Lowry's healthy, it does send shivers down the spine. That's not really a sustainable plan. I would have to think that he'd get demoted pretty quickly if it shows that he's not capable of keeping up those minutes. But this is also a Jets team that's used Nemesnikov at 2C. So let's not act like it's crazy dog. It could happen. But with all that in mind, I do think Winnipeg is still cognizant of the fact that Toews alone doesn't really get you to the dance. You've got to find a much bigger 2C solution. Now, there continues to be a lot of buzz around guys like Pettersson maybe being available. But I think the Jets are probably looking more in the margins. Guys whose names are on, maybe not are not on the board yet, haven't really been as discussed. I continue to wonder if the Islanders become Winnipeg's port of call. You've got 3 different centers out there who could do a job for the Jets. Kind of from top to bottom, I think Barzal's probably the first and most intriguing. Then you've got Horvat, and then you've got Pajot. Now, in terms of preference, I kind of go back and forth on this. Horvat does fill a pretty decent need, but he's signed for a good long while, and I think he has some trade protection that would kind of make that a little bit of a challenge. Barzal, too, has some trade protection that he probably won't waive to come to the Jets, and Pajot, for me, is he's an okay veteran, but, the days of his Sens performances have kind of passed him by, so I'm not really interested in that. There has been some buzz out of Vegas that they're trying to move Wild Bill Karlsson. And Karlsson, if you're looking for a stopgap 2C, he would actually do a pretty good job. His two-way impacts are pretty decent. He can still shoot the puck well. He skates reasonably well enough. And his cap hit for the next year or two is very reasonable. It's a little under $6 million. He'll do a fair job. And again, maybe you're not looking at the most elite 2C, but it's a much better solution to what the Jets have than trying to have Nemesnikov do it. And especially if you're still dealing with an ailing Lowry, your center depth coming down to something like Scheifele, Karlsson, Lowry, Taves, Nemestikov, that's actually pretty decent. Then you kind of have to wonder who's going to be on the flanks, and I think that that's maybe a bigger question, especially if Ehlers does leave. But, bringing in Evangelista, you can maybe ask Lambert and Chibrikov to fight for spots. There's real, ways around this that you could do both internally and externally. Carlson, I don't know if he's also going to be that expensive just because, Vegas is trying to dump cap. They've got to clear some space. And if he does become the target, and, I don't think he'd really be averse to coming to Winnipeg as far as I know, I could see it working out. He'd be moving to a President's Trophy team. Vegas is probably going to accept a not crazy trade package for him. And if they do ask for slightly more, a little bit of a sweetener, I don't think the Jets would really have any trouble giving that up. The Knights are very, pragmatic, and they don't care about the in-conference stuff as much. So, in this case, I don't really think that they worry about it. If anything, they would just feel like they're getting rid of an older center, clearing out some cap space to make some moves, all that stuff, yada, yada. So there's some real opportunity here. If the Jets try the free agent market, that's probably my least desirable option. Pia Suter is probably one of those guys that's a little more up there in terms of free agents. That's a player that I could definitely see coming into Winnipeg and doing a pretty good job in a middle six capacity. But aside from that, not a lot that I would be super hot to trot for. And we're still sort of waiting to see what happens with the Sabres. Buffalo is all over the place with the reporting as far as how guys are feeling about the team, who's pissed off, who's happy. And so that leaves quite a bit of opportunity for the Jets to maybe make some hay. I think Winnipeg has picks and prospects it could make for some sort of a power play if they want to move for one of the bigger Sabres prospects or young players. Buffalo might be looking for a change of scenery for one of their guys. It's an interesting thought. Do I think it's going to happen? I'm a little less inclined to see it right now just because I feel like other teams might be willing to pony up. But, and I will say this is one big advantage of a failed trade deadline this past, March. There's a lot more urgency, I think, and more pressure on the Jets front office to make something happen. I think this past summer, or really this past playoff run, kind of felt like for the team a collective missed opportunity. Would it have made a difference if they'd beaten Dallas and moved on to Edmonton? Maybe not. The Oilers are a very strong team, and right now, even they're having trouble with the Panthers. So, Winnipeg's just not as deep as these squads, and maybe that would have gotten exposed. But if the Jets had a more successful trade deadline or even a more successful offseason last year, maybe things would have fared a little bit differently. I tend to think the trade deadline's the much bigger thing. Generally speaking, the last few years of Chevy's work have been very positive. So I think it's really just this past March that was not great. And so, with that sort of being in the near-term consideration, there's some real onus on Winnipeg to do something big. And it does feel like with all the assets that they've saved, the stuff that they didn't spend, and all these teams looking to sell off some quality players that the Jets could use, this feels like a good opportunity for Chevy to do some work. I know some folks will feel like maybe the cup window has sort of passed this team. I go back and forth on this because on the one hand, I do agree that maybe it's a little bit out of reach just because the bar is so high with these teams like the Panthers and whatnot that maybe the Jets can't close that distance. The other part of me feels like just give yourself a chance. You never know what's going to happen in the postseason. And if you make these acquisitions and it doesn't work, but you still get further, that to me is a win. That's all I've ever wanted from this team is to just put itself in the best, place to try and win stuff. It doesn't matter to me if they necessarily pull it off. I just want to be along for a really good ride. And I think that that's really all any of us could ever ask for. If the team continues to handicap itself, well, that's not where you're going to find a lot of success and sympathy. But if the team gives every measure that they can, the front office throws their weight behind big moves, the players continue to do their part, that's all I could ever ask for as a fan. In my mind, I think the players have actually really anteed up and put their best out there for everyone. I know that maybe had some challenges in the playoffs, but eventually I think most of everyone you felt gave as much as they could. And so really now it's on the front office to make something happen. And I think that this could be a very, very fun summer for the Jets. This is a prime target of opportunity, lots of stuff in play, and I think the Jets are going to come out with some really good pieces that maybe don't wow people right off the bat, but once they start to get those Jets unis on and actually start skating for Winnipeg as the preseason and regular season rolls around in a few months, we might all start feeling just a little bit better about the upcoming season. But curious to know your thoughts on all this. How do you feel about the rumors? Are you excited about the acquisitions? Are you skeptical in some ways? Drop your thoughts below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. And just a quick sec, I also want to talk about how imminent some of the stuff is and some of the biggest outstanding pieces of business for the Jets awaiting them ahead of July 1st. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's show as we're just wrapping up with some thoughts on the horizon for the Winnipeg Jets being very busy. This is going to be a pretty crazy summer in a lot of ways. We're going to have big departures. We're going to have big acquisitions. At least that's what I'm expecting. And I think the Jets have some very big decisions to make. Now, the easiest one that's outstanding that they're going to have to wrap up pretty quickly here is Dylan Samberg's long-term contract. That is sealed, signed, delivered. I've heard rumors that Dylan wants to be a Jet long-term, and this is just, again, Winnipeg's a small city, so it's hearsay, but usually there's some credence to that. I mean, it's not like these guys make a big secret of it. And as far as anyone knows, and as far as the NHL media is concerned, Dylan seems to really like being a Jet. He's kind of like a hometown boy in a way. Not quite that close, but close enough. Minnesota, just a hop, skip, and a jump, really. And he has settled into really becoming one of our team's most pivotal defenders and one of the most important pieces of this core. So that 6-7 year deal that's probably incoming, 8 if we're really blessed, I think is really just a matter of time, and I expect it to get done over the next couple of weeks. It's going to happen soon. I guess the only question for me is the price tag. I'm really wondering what you pay him, because traditionally defenders who don't score don't get paid. It's just a thing. It tends to be a rule of habit. But with the increased cap going forward, and maybe him having some real evidence that he's played a pretty pivotal role in Winnipeg's record of success. Just look at it with him versus without him this past season. It's not a pretty picture without him. So I don't know if that really counts in these negotiations. Usually the scorecard's kind of more critical, but even there, he wasn't bad. So color me intrigued. I kind of feel like we're settling around the $5 million per season range, but again, that's speculation. We'll have to see how it all pans out. I am pretty excited about that, though. A long-term Samberg signing will be such a core piece locked up for many years to come for the Jets. Next piece of business, it's figuring out what you're doing with the Ehlers. And I can promise you, if the Jets don't get him signed, there are going to be quite a few teams out there that immediately make a lot of sense. Marner's leaving Toronto. Carolina needs scoring help. All these teams that are going to have some major cap space available to them are going to make a play for Ehlers. And the question for him is where he thinks he can get the best chance to win. The funny thing about Carolina, and I do get some stick for this because they are routine conference finals appearance, specialists, is yes, they are getting further than the Jets, but apparently every time they get to the conference finals, it always ends the same way. Maybe Ehlers can be what pushes them over the hump, but man, best chance to win, it's not going to be many places that can satisfy this. But I could also see scenarios where some team that's maybe a little more in the middle of the pack, but is still close enough to be in touching distance, offers Nick a huge pile of money. A team that kind of comes to mind and has really sat sort of on my periphery has been Utah. They just feel like a team that's waiting for a big move, and a Nick Ehlers acquisition in free agency could be something to that. They might make a play for Marner. I could see them going that route. But an Ehlers one would be intriguing. You might be able to get him for cheaper. You can maybe negotiate the term a little more. And Ehlers would be a phenomenal addition to the way that Turney plays. Man, that's a fast countering team. He's going to be a menace in the Central Division. And so long as Nick stays healthy, he is a huge boost to that team. And they're already very good power plays. So keep an eye out on that. For Winnipeg, I just don't think that there's really a way that they bring him back. Unless they're willing to pay above market or something, I just feel like he's lost too much money here. That's really one of the biggest reasons why I feel like it's at this point a no-brainer. He's lost millions being underutilized with the Jets. And so for him to leave, no one could blame him. I guess what happens, or what will be interesting to watch is Chris Johnston, who doesn't usually have inside information. He did mention Carolina and Chicago as being potential destinations. The Chicago thing to me is probably the Hawks really leaking their interest. I think they are desperate to get Bedard some help. So that could be a play that they make if they offer him like a stupid amount of money. Maybe that's the kind of thing that would convince him, but I don't know. I feel like at the stage of Nick's career, he just wants a chance to really prove himself and, make a decent chunk of cash while also having a real cup aspiration. And, there are plenty of teams out there that could do it. I guess my nightmare scenario is if he somehow ends up in Florida. The Panthers bringing him in under Maurice would be very funny. I can't imagine that Maurice would actually play him that much either, but hey, maybe Paul has learned something since, the good old days of Winnipeg Jets hockey. But as far as, Ehlers is concerned, the ball's firmly in his court. I don't expect him to stay. I think we all kind of read the tea leaves here, and maybe for both parties, this kind of has to happen. It's obviously going to be hard for the Jets to really deal with the loss of Nick. And I think that there are bigger organizational questions about what lessons they learned from all of this. But in the interim, at least, maybe this will give some chances for some of the younger kids to really step up. Again, this year could be a real year of transition and maybe sort of an evolution for the Jets into the next stage of their core. I don't know what that looks like yet. I can't tell you if it's going to be good, but at least it'll be different. This could be a very different offseason than we're used to. So all of this is both exciting, a little nervy. I will say that, I've had for the past couple of years not a lot of insight or thought into what the Jets are going to do. Each year I've thought maybe they're going to make some big changes. They've tried to run it back as much as they can. This offseason has a distinctly different feel. I don't know why. I don't know if it's Chipman really, talking about the need for progress, sort of the growth from last season to this season, and all that kind of feeding into this. But it does feel like we're on the precipice of something big with this team. Only time will tell if it's going to be something really positive. But, the slight optimist in me wants to be very excited about what we'll see. If the Evangelista stuff is to be believed, though, it is trending in a more positive direction, and that's the kind of move that I think the Jets really can benefit from. Translate that to much bigger moves in the near future, and things are starting to look real intriguing for Winnipeg's upcoming season. But give me your big predictions. Let me know where you think Ehlers ends up, whether it's Winnipeg or somebody else. Let me know what you think he's actually going to make in free agency. I kind of am sitting around the $8 million mark, but that's a bit of a tough one because he hasn't played as many games as some other free agents out there, and he just doesn't have the counting stats right now to back it up because, again, he's been underutilized. But let me know what you're thinking. Drop your thoughts below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's show, though, that's all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.